Navy engineers struggled with a stalled amphibious vehicle until the Admiral called a Navy legend. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a routine exercise at the naval base. The engineers were working on an amphibious vehicle, but something wasn't right. The massive machine, designed to navigate both land and water, had stalled in the middle of the testing field. A group of Navy engineers, experts in their field, surrounded the vehicle. They were poking and prodding, testing the wiring and mechanical systems, but no matter what they tried, it wouldn't start. The engineers exchanged worried glances. They had checked everything, from the engine to the electrical components, but nothing seemed to work. This wasn't just any vehicle. This amphibious craft was critical for upcoming operations, and with time running out, the tension in the air grew thicker. At the front of the group, one of the lead engineers, a young and confident officer, stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head in frustration. "It's not the engine," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "There's something we're missing. I don't know what it is, but we need to figure it out fast." The hours stretched on, and their attempts became more desperate. They had already tried every solution they could think of, and each failure only added to their anxiety. The vehicle remained stubbornly still, its engine silent, its potential untapped. The pressure was mounting. With each passing minute, the consequences of this failure became clearer. This wasn't just a test. This was a matter of national security. It was critical to get the vehicle operational. The young engineer, now sweating and visibly stressed, paced around the vehicle, kicking at the dirt in frustration. He finally stopped and took a deep breath. "We need to escalate this," he said, trying to stay calm. "I'll call it in. We need someone who can solve this." But as the engineer reached for his phone, another figure approached. An older man, wearing civilian clothes, stood in the distance. He had been watching the engineers for a while now, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm and unreadable. The young engineer didn't give him a second glance. "Who's that guy?" he asked one of his colleagues. "I don't know," came the reply, "but he's been here for a while. Probably just some old vet." The man's age didn't seem to fit with the high-stakes nature of the situation, but he was certainly looking at the vehicle with a level of focus that caught the attention of the engineer. The older man, standing silently, observed the engineers working on the vehicle. His eyes, sharp despite his years, seemed to be calculating something. His gaze moved over the vehicle methodically, as if he was studying it in a way the engineers hadn't. After a few moments, the old man slowly stepped forward. "You're going to need more than just modern tools to fix this," he said softly, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. The engineers looked at him in surprise. "Who are you?" the lead engineer asked, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "I'm just someone who knows how to get things done," the old man replied, his eyes never leaving the vehicle. The young engineer rolled his eyes, not interested in what this man had to say. "We don't have time for your stories, old man," he snapped. "We've got this covered." But the older man didn't flinch. He walked up to the vehicle and started pointing to various parts, his fingers moving with purpose. "The issue isn't in the engine," he said. "It's in the fuel line. It's clogged, likely from the last operation. You've been trying to fix everything else, but that's the root of the problem." The lead engineer, still skeptical, walked up to the vehicle to inspect what the old man had pointed out. For the first time, he seemed to pause, considering the possibility that this stranger might actually know something. But then his skepticism kicked in. "We've checked the fuel line already," he said. "You're mistaken." The old man smiled faintly. "Sometimes the solution is right under your nose. Let me show you." Without waiting for permission, the old man reached into his jacket, pulled out a small tool, and began working on the fuel line. The engineers watched, perplexed. What was he doing? How did he know about the internal workings of this advanced vehicle? Within minutes, the engine sputtered to life. The vehicle roared to life, its engines growling as they came back online. The engineers stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The old man turned to the lead engineer, who stood there in stunned silence. "You'll need to learn to trust experience," he said quietly. Just then, a convoy of military vehicles arrived, screeching to a halt. Out stepped a man in a pristine uniform, his silver stars gleaming in the sunlight. The man walked toward the old man, who turned to face him. There was no mistaking the look in the general's eyes as he recognized the older man. "I didn't expect to see you here, old friend," the general said, offering a firm handshake. The engineers, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, stood in awe as they realized who the old man was. This wasn't just any civilian. He was a Navy legend. The general, now smiling with respect, turned to the engineers. "Gentlemen, this is Chief Warrant Officer James Ironclad McCabe. He doesn't need fancy tools or equipment to get things done. He's forgotten more about these vehicles than you'll ever know." The engineers, stunned and humbled, watched as the general gave a respectful salute to the man who had just solved their biggest problem. The legend had spoken, and his wisdom had turned their failure into triumph. The sound of the engines revving echoed across the base, as the amphibious vehicle hummed back to life. The once stagnant machine was now purring like a well-oiled beast, thanks to the expertise of the old Navy legend, Chief Warrant Officer James Ironclad McCabe. The engineers stood frozen in place, their mouths agape, unable to believe what had just transpired. The young lead engineer, who had been so confident in his abilities just hours before, now found himself utterly humbled. He had been certain that they had covered all their bases, that there was no way a simple, elderly man could know more than the team of high-tech engineers. But he had been proven wrong. The general, still standing beside McCabe, looked over at the stunned group of engineers. With a small nod of acknowledgement, he turned back to McCabe. "You never cease to amaze me, old friend," the general said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. McCabe, who had been silent the entire time, simply nodded in return. His expression was calm, almost distant, as if fixing a stalled vehicle was just another day on the job for him. "It's all about experience," McCabe replied quietly, his voice gruff but steady. The general let out a low chuckle. "Experience," he echoed, "and humility." The engineers, still processing what had happened, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the old man standing before them. They had spent hours trying to figure out the problem, using the latest technology and diagnostic tools, but it had been McCabe's experience, his old-school know-how, that had solved the issue in mere minutes. "We've got a lot to learn from you, sir," the lead engineer finally said, his voice softer than before. McCabe gave him a simple nod, but didn't speak. The engineers had all been trained in the latest methods, but none of them could match the kind of hands-on knowledge that McCabe had accumulated over decades of service. They had been taught to trust their tools, their computers, their manuals, but McCabe knew something that they didn't. Sometimes, the most valuable tool was the one between your ears, the one that came from years of experience in the field. As the engineers began to disperse, still in awe of what had just transpired, the general turned to McCabe. "I'm glad you were here today," he said, his tone shifting from casual to more serious. "You've got an eye for these things that no one else has." McCabe glanced over at him, his face unreadable. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, General," he said, his voice low. "Some things you can't learn in a textbook." The general nodded, understanding. "I was afraid of that," he muttered, half to himself. McCabe raised an eyebrow. "Afraid?" The general's eyes darkened slightly. "We've got a big problem coming down the line," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "And we need men like you. The kind who know how to handle themselves when everything goes wrong." McCabe remained silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "I'm not the man I used to be, General," he finally said. "But I've got enough left in me to help out when it counts." The general's lips pressed into a thin line as he gave McCabe a solemn nod. "We're counting on you, old friend. Just like we always have." McCabe didn't respond, but his eyes gleamed with something, a flicker of the soldier he once was, the one who had fought and bled for his country. "Where do you need me?" McCabe asked, his tone serious now, the weight of the conversation not lost on him. The general exhaled slowly, as if the burden of what was coming had just become heavier. "I'll brief you tomorrow," he said. "For now, I think you've earned a little rest." McCabe looked at the general for a moment before giving him a curt nod. "I'll be ready when you need me." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the engineers still standing by the amphibious vehicle, their minds racing with what they had just witnessed. As McCabe made his way across the base, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease in his gut. He had always trusted his instincts, and they were telling him that something big was coming. Something that would require all of his experience, all of his knowledge, and all of his grit. The question was, what kind of storm was on the horizon, and how much of it would he be able to weather? The next morning, Chief Warrant Officer James, Ironclad McCabe, arrived at the base early, long before most of the engineers and soldiers had even begun their daily routines. He preferred the quiet of the early hours, when the base was still, and he could think clearly, without distractions. The sky was just beginning to lighten, casting a faint orange glow across the parking lot as McCabe made his way to the command building. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a palpable tension in the air, and his instincts were telling him that the general was about to reveal something important, something he wasn't ready for. Inside the building, the general was waiting for him, already deep in conversation with a few of his senior officers. They all paused when McCabe entered, and the room fell silent. The general, who had once been a young, energetic officer full of optimism, was now a man hardened by years of service. His expression was grim as he motioned for McCabe to take a seat. "I'm glad you're here," the general said, his voice heavy. "We've got a situation." McCabe sat down, his face unreadable. He had learned long ago to stay calm in moments like these. "What's going on, General?" he asked, his voice steady. The general glanced around at the officers in the room before turning his gaze back to McCabe. "There's been a rise in hostilities in the region," the general explained, his voice tight with concern. "And it's not just the usual threats. This time, it's different. We've got new intelligence suggesting that an enemy faction has begun to take advantage of the chaos in the area. They've got new weapons, and they're using them against our forces." McCabe listened closely, his mind already racing through scenarios and calculations. He had seen plenty of action in his day, but he could sense that the situation the general was describing was going to be unlike anything he had encountered before. "What do you need me to do?" McCabe asked, his voice low and firm. The general took a deep breath before speaking. "We're assembling a team to deal with this," he said. "But it's going to require someone with experience, someone who knows how to handle high-risk operations, someone who can make the hard decisions when it matters most." McCabe's eyes narrowed as he processed the words. He knew what the general was asking. "You want me to lead the operation?" McCabe said quietly. The general nodded, his gaze never leaving McCabe's face. "I do. We need someone who can get things done without hesitation. Someone who can think on their feet and make split-second decisions under pressure. And we need someone who knows the terrain, who's been in these kinds of situations before." McCabe remained silent for a moment, his mind running through the possibilities. He had left active duty years ago, preferring a quieter life. But there were times when the call to action was too strong to ignore, and this felt like one of those times. "All right," McCabe said, his voice resolute. "I'll do it." The general's face softened, a hint of relief in his eyes. "I knew I could count on you, James," he said. "We're going to need you at your best for this. It won't be easy, but I know you're the right man for the job." As the officers around the table nodded in agreement, McCabe stood up, his posture straight and confident. He had made his decision, and now there was no turning back. "When do we leave?" McCabe asked, already shifting into his old mindset. "Within the hour," the general replied. "We'll brief you on the specifics when we get to the operations site." McCabe nodded and turned to leave the room, his mind already calculating the next steps. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air hit his face, and he felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the mission that would test his skills, his resolve, and his ability to lead. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. As the convoy of military vehicles rolled out of the base, McCabe sat in the lead truck, his thoughts focused on what lay ahead. The team would need all of their expertise, all of their training, and all of their courage to face the challenges ahead. The mission was critical, and failure wasn't an option. McCabe glanced at the young soldiers around him, their faces a mix of anticipation and anxiety. They were counting on him, just as they had counted on him in the past. It was time to remind them what true leadership looked like. The convoy traveled for several hours, the landscape changing as they moved farther from the safety of the base. As they approached the operations site, McCabe could feel the weight of the task ahead settling in. They were about to step into the unknown, and there was no telling what they would find. When they arrived, the team quickly set up their base of operations, a temporary command center surrounded by armored vehicles. The sound of equipment being unloaded, the movement of soldiers, and the buzz of radio chatter filled the air. McCabe stood off to the side for a moment, surveying the scene. He had been through countless operations in the past, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the enemy they were facing, it was the unknown. The enemy had new weapons, new tactics, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. The team would have to adapt quickly. As the briefing began, McCabe listened intently, absorbing the details of the mission. His mind was already racing ahead, formulating strategies and contingencies. The team would need to move fast, act decisively, and rely on their instincts. But most importantly, they would need to trust each other. McCabe looked around at his team, his soldiers, his friends. They had been through thick and thin together, and now they were about to face one of their toughest challenges yet. The tension in the room was palpable, but McCabe knew that, together, they could handle whatever came their way. "Let's do this," McCabe said, his voice steady and confident. The team nodded, and one by one, they filed out of the room, ready to face the unknown. As McCabe followed them out into the bright, unforgiving sun, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was why he had come back. To lead, to protect, and to fight for something bigger than himself. The operation had been in full swing for hours, and the sun was beginning to set as McCabe and his team moved through the dense jungle terrain. The mission was now at a critical stage. They had already encountered resistance from enemy forces, and their movements had to be swift and precise. The team was operating on a tight timeline, and failure was not an option. McCabe's mind was focused, analyzing every detail, anticipating every move. He had seen this kind of operation before, but there was something about this mission that made it feel different. It wasn't just the terrain or the enemy, it was the urgency. The stakes were higher than ever. As the team moved forward, McCabe's eyes scanned the area, his instincts kicking in. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were getting closer to the enemy's stronghold, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. The enemy had already fortified their position, and McCabe knew they would have to fight their way in. The sound of the jungle was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint crack of branches underfoot. Every step felt heavier than the last. McCabe glanced over at his team. They were alert, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. They knew what was at stake. "Stay sharp," McCabe whispered, his voice barely audible above the noise of the jungle. The soldiers nodded, their faces set with determination. As they approached the enemy's camp, McCabe held up a hand, signaling for everyone to stop. He crouched down, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area ahead. The enemy's position was well hidden, but McCabe had been in enough firefights to know exactly where they were. "They're close," he muttered under his breath. "We're not far from their main base." The team waited in silence, their breath held as they prepared for the inevitable clash. McCabe's mind was running through the plan, adjusting for any changes. Every decision counted. Every second mattered. He knew they had to move quickly. They couldn't afford to waste any time. "Move out," McCabe commanded, his voice low and steady. The team sprung into action, moving swiftly and quietly through the dense brush. They reached the perimeter of the enemy base, crouching low to avoid detection. McCabe gave the signal to set up a perimeter around the camp. The soldiers moved into position, each one taking their designated spot with precision. McCabe stood in the center, scanning the area for any signs of movement. He could feel the tension building in his chest. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about protecting his team. He had seen too many good men fall in combat, and he wasn't going to let that happen again. "Ready when you are, Chief," one of the soldiers said, his voice steady. McCabe nodded, acknowledging the soldiers' readiness. They were all prepared for what was about to come. The sound of gunfire erupted suddenly from the enemy camp. McCabe didn't hesitate. "Go," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The team moved forward, charging into the camp with military precision. The enemy had no time to react as the soldiers overwhelmed them, taking control of the area within minutes. McCabe's heart raced as he led the charge, his years of combat experience kicking in. He could hear the screams of the enemy, the sound of gunfire, but it all felt distant. His focus was on the mission. Nothing else mattered. The team fought fiercely, pushing the enemy back and securing the perimeter. McCabe moved through the chaos with a calm, unwavering determination. Every move was calculated, every decision precise. They were making progress, but they were still far from finished. McCabe's eyes narrowed as he spotted the enemy leader, a tall figure standing near the center of the camp. Without thinking, McCabe raised his rifle and took aim. The shot rang out, and the enemy leader collapsed to the ground. The rest of the enemy forces quickly surrendered, their morale shattered by the loss of their leader. McCabe signaled for the team to hold their position as they began to secure the area. The mission was a success, but McCabe wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He knew they had to clear the rest of the base before they could call it a day. The team moved quickly, securing every building, every corner. As they made their way to the command center, McCabe's heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the door, was a familiar figure. General Thompson. "You've done it again, McCabe," the general said, his voice filled with admiration. McCabe nodded, but his expression remained serious. "The mission's not over yet, sir," he replied. "We still need to clear the rest of the base." General Thompson smiled, stepping aside to allow McCabe and his team to enter. "You're right," he said, "but you've done more than enough to secure this area. Now, we've got one more thing to handle." McCabe followed the general into the command center, his mind already shifting to the next phase of the mission. There was no time to rest. Not yet. As they entered the room, McCabe could see the map of the area spread out on the table, a dozen soldiers gathered around, analyzing the situation. McCabe felt a weight settle in his chest as he looked at the map. This wasn't just a military operation. This was a battle for survival. The enemy had been pushed back, but McCabe knew they were far from defeated. The war was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, McCabe felt the familiar thrill of battle surge through him. This was where he belonged. This was where he could make a difference. As McCabe and his team cleared the last building on the enemy base, the weight of the operation began to settle on him. The mission had been a success, but the cost was evident. Several of the soldiers had been wounded during the fight, though none seriously. McCabe stood outside the command center, his eyes scanning the horizon as the setting sun bathed the landscape in a blood-orange glow. The air felt heavy, thick with both the aftermath of the battle and the weight of the decisions he had just made. The general had been right. This was only the beginning. "Good job, Chief," a voice called from behind. McCabe turned to see Sergeant Daniels, one of his trusted soldiers, walking up to him, his face weary but determined. "You got us through this, just like you always do." McCabe gave him a short nod, but didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the map inside the command center. They had secured the area, but there was something nagging at him. Something didn't sit right. He had been in enough operations to know when to trust his gut. And right now, his gut was telling him that this was far from over. "Where's the general?" McCabe asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying urgency. Daniels looked at him for a moment before gesturing toward the building. "He's with the team, going over the after-action reports. You should join them." McCabe didn't wait for any more information. He turned and walked toward the building, his steps steady and purposeful. Inside, the general and a handful of officers were already seated, the room quiet except for the sound of papers being shuffled and the occasional murmur. McCabe entered without knocking, his presence immediately commanding attention. "What's the situation, General?" McCabe asked, his tone crisp and direct. General Thompson looked up, his face hardening as he met McCabe's gaze. "I've got some bad news," he said, his voice low. "We've just received intel that another faction has mobilized. This one's bigger, more organized, and more aggressive." McCabe raised an eyebrow. "How soon before they hit us?" The general sighed, rubbing his temples. "They could be on the move right now. We don't have much time." McCabe's mind started working at full speed, calculating their next moves, assessing the resources they had left. The team was tired, and they had already pushed themselves to their limits. But McCabe knew they had no choice. "We need to hit them first," McCabe said, his voice firm with authority. "We can't wait for them to come to us. We need to disrupt their operations, take out their supply lines, and force them into a defensive position." General Thompson leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "That's what I was thinking, but we don't have enough men for a full-scale attack. We need to move quickly, but carefully." McCabe's eyes flicked to the map on the table. The enemy's position was marked in red, their most recent. movements tracked in real time. We don't need a full-scale attack, McCabe said, his mind already working out a plan. We need a small team, high precision, strike fast, create chaos, and disappear before they can react. The general looked at him for a moment, then nodded. All right, Chief. You're in charge, but you'll have to choose your team carefully. This isn't going to be a simple raid. McCabe's lips twitched into a brief smile. I've got the perfect team in mind. With that, McCabe turned to Daniels, who was standing near the door. Get the team ready. We're going in. No time to waste. Daniels nodded and hurried off to assemble the group. As McCabe watched him go, his thoughts were already on the mission ahead. They would have to move fast and with precision. The team would be small, just a handful of soldiers, each one handpicked for their skills and experience. It was going to be a dangerous mission, but McCabe had no doubt they could pull it off. This was what he had been trained for. This was his element. As he stood there, his mind running through the plan one last time, a voice from the back of the room broke his concentration. You sure about this, Chief? It was Sergeant Parker, the unit's marksman, his voice low and uncertain. McCabe turned, locking eyes with him. You got a better idea? He asked, his voice calm but with a hint of challenge. Parker hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. No, sir, he said, his tone resigned but steady. McCabe gave him a brief nod. Then get ready. We're going to hit them hard and fast. As the team assembled, McCabe quickly ran through the plan. They would move under the cover of darkness, infiltrate the enemy's base, and sabotage their equipment, throwing them into disarray. The soldiers would need to work in tandem, relying on their training and instincts to get in and out before the enemy even knew what hit them. McCabe had done this 100 times before, but this mission felt different. There was something about the enemy's movements that bothered him, a sense of urgency that he couldn't shake. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it now. They had a job to do. As the team prepared to leave, McCabe couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. He was ready. They were all ready. And with that, they set off into the night, knowing that their mission could change the course of the entire operation. They were about to take the fight to the enemy, and McCabe was determined to make sure they would succeed, no matter what it took. The team moved swiftly through the dense underbrush, their boots sinking into the soft earth with each step. The night had fallen, and the jungle was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. But the soldiers were focused, their senses sharp, ready for the mission ahead. McCabe led the way, his face expressionless as he pushed through the thick foliage. The mission had started hours ago, but he still felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He had made the decision to lead this operation, and he would see it through to the end. There was no turning back now. They had moved under the cover of darkness, and as they neared the enemy's position, McCabe signaled for the team to stop. His hand shot up, a silent command. The team froze, their eyes scanning the area, their ears alert to any sound that might signal danger. McCabe took a deep breath and surveyed the enemy base. The structure loomed in the distance, illuminated only by a few dim lights. They had reached the outskirts, and the time for stealth was running out. We're in position, McCabe whispered, his voice low but firm. We hit them fast and hard. No mistakes. His team nodded, their expressions tense but resolute. They knew what was at stake. The enemy had to be caught off guard. This wasn't just a raid. It was their best chance to cripple the enemy's operations before they could strike back. McCabe's plan was simple. Break into the base, take out the communication lines, and sabotage their weapons cache. The enemy would be disoriented, and they would have the element of surprise. They would need to work quickly, with precision, and without hesitation. McCabe crouched down, signaling his team to follow. They moved in a tight formation, each soldier taking their assigned position. The sound of their movements was muffled by the dense foliage, their presence barely detectable. They were ghosts in the night, moving with the speed and skill of trained professionals. As they neared the perimeter of the base, McCabe could see the guards posted at regular intervals. They were relaxed, not expecting an attack, and that was to their advantage. McCabe signaled for the team to split into two groups. One would take out the guards on the left flank, the other would handle the right. McCabe's group would breach the gate. On my mark, he whispered, his voice steady. 3, 2, 1. With a swift, coordinated motion, the team moved into action. The quiet crack of gunfire shattered the stillness as the guards on the left flank fell, one by one. On the right, The other team did the same. Within seconds, the perimeter was secure. McCabe gave the signal, and the team moved toward the gate. They had no time to waste. As McCabe approached the gate, he could feel his heart rate pick up, the adrenaline surging through his veins. This was the critical moment. They needed to breach the gate and get inside before the enemy realized what was happening. He pulled out the explosive charges, carefully placing them on the gate's lock. The countdown began in his head. 3, 2, 1. The blast was deafening. The gate flew open, and McCabe led the charge into the heart of the base. The team stormed in, their weapons raised, ready to eliminate any threats that came their way. The enemy was disoriented, caught off guard by the speed and precision of the attack. McCabe moved quickly, his eyes scanning for any sign of the target. He knew they had to reach the communication center before the enemy could regroup. They took out several more guards as they moved deeper into the base. The mission was going smoothly, but McCabe knew it wasn't over yet. They still had to secure the weapons cache and destroy it before they left. As they reached the communications center, McCabe gave the signal for the team to spread out. They moved into position, taking out the guards one by one. It wasn't long before they were inside, and McCabe set to work disabling the communication equipment. He moved quickly, his hands steady as he cut the wires and planted the charges. Time was running out. He could feel the pressure building, but he pushed it aside. Focus. That was all that mattered. Once the charges were set, McCabe signaled for the team to move out. They were almost done. They needed to destroy the weapons cache, then exfiltrate the base before the enemy could respond. The team moved quickly, navigating the base with the precision of a well-oiled machine. As they reached the weapons cache, McCabe planted the final explosives. Clear out, he ordered, his voice low but urgent. The team moved to the designated extraction point, the weight of the mission starting to lift. The charges exploded, sending a shockwave through the base. The weapons cache was destroyed. They had accomplished their mission. McCabe let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't over yet. They still had to exfiltrate the base. But they had done it. The mission was a success. The team made their way back through the jungle, their movements quick but calculated. They had achieved their objective, and they would return to base as heroes. But for McCabe, the mission had always been about more than just the victory. It had been about protecting his team, ensuring their safety, and doing whatever it took to get the job done. As they reached the extraction point, McCabe turned to his team, his expression grim but satisfied. Good work, everyone, he said. Let's get out of here. The team piled into the extraction vehicles, their spirits high despite the toll the mission had taken on them. They had done it. And McCabe couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was what he had been trained for. This was why he had come back. The convoy moved through the jungle, the base behind them now a smoldering ruin. They had accomplished what they set out to do. But as McCabe looked out over the horizon, he knew that the war was far from over. This was just one battle in a much larger conflict, and they would be ready for whatever came next. The convoy rumbled through the dense jungle, its tires kicking up dust and debris as they made their way back to base. McCabe sat in the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead, his mind still processing the mission they had just completed. The adrenaline was wearing off, and now all that remained was the weight of what they had accomplished. The team had successfully infiltrated the enemy base, disabled their communication systems, and destroyed their weapons cache. The mission had been a success, but McCabe couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The general had mentioned something about a larger threat, and McCabe couldn't help but wonder what that meant for the future. He knew better than to let his guard down now. As the convoy reached the outskirts of the base, McCabe gave a signal for the vehicles to slow down. The men in the back of the convoy were tired, but there was no time for rest. They still had to debrief and assess the full scope of the operation. The base loomed in the distance, its towering structures barely visible through the trees. The sound of helicopter blades filled the air as they touched down on the helipad, and the team began unloading their gear. The sense of urgency was still palpable. McCabe had always been a man of action, and he knew that the next steps had to be carefully planned. He walked with purpose, his boots clicking against the pavement as he made his way to the command center. The general was already there, surrounded by his senior officers. They were going over the after-action reports, but McCabe could sense the tension in the room. The success of the mission had not eliminated the threat, it had only delayed it. McCabe, the general said, his voice steady but with an undertone of concern. "We need to talk." McCabe nodded and took a seat at the table. The officers around him fell silent, waiting for the general to speak. "What's the situation?" McCabe asked, his voice calm but filled with anticipation. The general took a deep breath before speaking. "The enemy's not just a rogue faction. We've been receiving intel that points to something much larger. This group is well-funded, well-equipped, and highly organized. They've been using the chaos to their advantage, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of their operations." McCabe listened intently, his mind racing as he processed the information. He had suspected that something larger was at play, but now it was confirmed. "How soon before they strike again?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "We don't know," the general replied. "But we need to be ready. We can't afford to let our guard down. The enemy is already mobilizing, and we need to strike before they can organize a full-scale attack." McCabe's mind went into overdrive. He had seen the chaos of war before. But this was different. The enemy wasn't just another group of insurgents. They were a well-organized force with resources and tactics that could change the course of the conflict. "What's our next move?" McCabe asked, already thinking about the resources they would need. "We've got two options," the general said. "We either launch a preemptive strike, take out their key infrastructure and leadership, or we focus on intelligence gathering, track their movements, and prepare for a larger operation down the line." McCabe weighed the options carefully. A preemptive strike would give them the upper hand, but it could also provoke a larger conflict. On the other hand, intelligence gathering would give them more time to prepare, but it might allow the enemy to gain more ground. "We'll need more intel before we make a decision," McCabe said after a moment of contemplation. "We can't afford to act blindly, but we also can't sit back and wait." The general nodded. "Agreed. We'll deploy reconnaissance teams to gather information, but we need to be ready to move quickly if we get a clear target." McCabe stood up, his mind already moving on to the next phase of the operation. "I'll start organizing the teams. We'll need our best men for this." The general gave him a sharp look. "Don't take any chances. We need to keep this quiet until we have a solid plan." McCabe nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. He had seen enough to know that the next few days could change everything. As McCabe left the command center, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. The team was ready for what was coming, but it wasn't going to be easy. This enemy was unlike anything they had faced before. But McCabe had spent his career fighting battles just like this, and he would do whatever it took to protect his men and complete the mission. The next few days would be critical, and McCabe knew that they would have to move fast. The enemy wouldn't wait, and neither could they. As he stepped outside, McCabe looked out over the base, the sun setting behind the horizon. There was no time to relax. The war was far from over, and McCabe knew that the hardest fight was still ahead. The days following the initial strike were tense. McCabe and his team had briefed, rebriefed, and set up their positions. Every move now felt like it was leading them to the next stage of a much larger, more dangerous operation. The general had ordered them to remain on high alert, but McCabe knew this wasn't just about waiting. The enemy had shown their cards, and now it was their turn to respond. The intel gathering teams had reported in, each one bringing more fragmented pieces of the puzzle. McCabe sat in the command center, eyes glued to the map in front of him. The data was clear. The enemy was not only well-organized, but also well-armed. They had a network that stretched across the region, with weapons and resources being funneled in from multiple sources. McCabe could feel the pressure mounting, but he couldn't afford to let it show. He stood up, his mind already formulating a plan of attack. The general walked in just as McCabe was finalizing the details. The older man's face was grim, his eyes narrowed with concern. "McCabe," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "We've got a problem." McCabe turned to face him, his expression serious. "What's the situation?" The general pointed to the map. "The enemy has just fortified a new position. They're more spread out now, and they're digging in. They're preparing for something big." McCabe's eyes flicked over the map, mentally recalculating the angles of attack. "They're expecting us," McCabe said, his voice low. The general nodded. "Exactly. We can't afford to wait for them to make the first move. It's time we hit them hard. But we need to be careful. This is not just a strike, it's a surgical operation." McCabe thought for a moment. He could feel the weight of the decision. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. The enemy was no longer just a nuisance. They were a threat, and it was time to deal with it. "We'll move in under the cover of night," McCabe said, his voice resolute. "We'll hit them at their weakest point and destroy their command structure. Disrupt their communications, hit their supply lines, and take out their leadership. Once we cripple them, we'll pull out before they even know what happened." The general gave a sharp nod. "Agreed. But you'll have to move quickly. No hesitation. We don't have the luxury of time." McCabe nodded in response. "I'll get the team ready." As McCabe walked out of the command center, he could feel the tension in the air. The men were ready, but he could see it in their eyes. They knew what was coming. They were about to walk into enemy territory, and the risk was high. But McCabe trusted them. He had trained them, led them through thick and thin, and now they would follow him into the fire once more. He gathered his team together in the briefing room, laying out the plan. "This is our target," McCabe said, pointing to the map. "We've got a limited window, and we can't afford to miss. We're going in fast, hard, and with no room for error. We hit them where it hurts, and we get out." The team listened intently, nodding in agreement. They had all been in operations like this before, but each one was different. This time, they were up against something bigger. But McCabe knew they could handle it. As the team prepared to move out, McCabe's mind was already on the mission ahead. He had always been a man of action, but this time, he felt the weight of leadership more than ever. This wasn't just about taking out an enemy. It was about protecting his men, ensuring their safety, and making sure they came out of this alive. As they loaded into the vehicles and began the drive toward the enemy position, McCabe's thoughts were focused. The convoy moved silently through the night, their headlights dimmed to avoid detection. They were almost there. McCabe checked his gear one last time, ensuring that everything was in place. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him that something was off. The air felt too still. There was something about this mission that didn't sit right with him. He pushed the thought aside. They couldn't afford to waste time on doubt. The operation was in motion. The convoy stopped a few miles outside the enemy's base. McCabe's team moved out, taking up positions as quietly as possible. The plan was simple: infiltrate, destroy, exfiltrate. But simple plans often went awry in combat. McCabe knew this better than anyone. "Move out," McCabe whispered to the team. They spread out, their movements coordinated, the sound of their boots barely a whisper in the night. As they neared the base, McCabe gave a signal for them to halt. He crouched low, peering through the scope of his rifle. The enemy camp was visible in the distance, but they hadn't detected them yet. McCabe's pulse quickened as the moment approached. He was about to lead his men into the heart of the enemy's territory. It would be a brutal fight, but he was ready. "Let's do this," he muttered to himself. The team moved forward, their steps synchronized as they approached the enemy base. The night air was thick with anticipation. They were on the edge of something much bigger than any of them realized. The mission wasn't just about winning this fight. It was about striking a blow that would resonate throughout the entire region. As they neared the base's perimeter, McCabe's focus sharpened. They were about to breach enemy lines, and every second counted. McCabe's team crouched low in the dense jungle, their eyes scanning the enemy base in the distance. The moment they had been preparing for was finally here. The quiet tension of the night was thick, and every man on McCabe's team knew the weight of what was about to unfold. There was no turning back now. The mission was set, and they had to execute with precision. McCabe gave the silent command to move forward. The team spread out, moving like shadows in the night. They had been through countless operations, but this one felt different. The enemy was more prepared than they had anticipated, and the stakes were higher than ever. As McCabe led the charge toward the base's perimeter, his mind raced. He knew the risks, but there was no room for hesitation. Their mission was clear: get in, disrupt the enemy's operations, and get out. No mistakes. McCabe and his team reached the outer perimeter of the enemy camp, and the faint glow of the base lights illuminated their surroundings. The guards were few, and they were scattered. McCabe's plan was to take out the perimeter guards silently, without alerting the enemy to their presence. The first target was within range. McCabe raised his rifle, his breath steady. He aimed and fired. The shot was quick and precise. The guard fell without a sound, his body hidden in the thick brush. McCabe signaled to the rest of the team to move. They advanced silently, their movements calculated. as they systematically took out each guard on the outer perimeter. Within minutes, the path was clear. They were in. McCabe felt a rush of adrenaline as the team entered the heart of the base. The time for stealth was over. They were in enemy territory now, and they had to move quickly. The team split into two groups. One would take out the communications center, the other would focus on the supply depot. McCabe led the group heading toward the communications center. His instincts were sharp, and his focus was razor-tight. They had to disrupt the enemy's ability to communicate, or else they would risk being overwhelmed. As they approached the building, McCabe gave the signal to halt. They had to take out the guards inside. McCabe positioned himself at the entrance and raised his hand, signaling the team to breach. The door crashed open, and the team stormed inside. The guards were caught off guard, but they quickly scrambled for their weapons. McCabe moved with deadly precision, taking out two of the guards before they could react. The rest of the team followed suit, securing the area. "Clear," McCabe said, his voice steady. He moved to the communication equipment, quickly assessing the situation. The enemy had a sophisticated system set up, but McCabe wasn't worried. He knew exactly what to do. He planted the explosives on the main server, ensuring it would destroy all the communication systems in the building. "We've got 2 minutes," McCabe said, glancing at his watch. The countdown had begun. "Let's move to the supply depot." McCabe led the team out of the building and toward the supply depot. The air was tense, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed in the distance. The enemy was starting to react. McCabe knew they didn't have much time before the base was on full alert. They reached the supply depot, and McCabe's team moved to plant explosives on the main stockpiles. The mission was almost complete, but the danger wasn't over. As the team set the charges, McCabe's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He motioned for the team to hurry. There was a sudden, sharp sound. The crack of gunfire. The enemy had spotted them. The team scrambled to finish planting the explosives, but the enemy was closing in fast. McCabe turned to one of his men. "Set the detonator. We're getting out now." The soldier nodded, quickly attaching the device to the explosives. McCabe's heart raced as he turned to lead the team out of the depot. "Go, go, go," he shouted. They sprinted through the base, their boots pounding on the hard ground as gunfire erupted behind them. McCabe's mind was focused on the mission's success, but now his priority was getting the team out alive. They reached the extraction point, but just as they were about to board the vehicles, McCabe heard a voice. "Not so fast." McCabe spun around to see an enemy officer, flanked by several soldiers, blocking their escape. The officer's eyes narrowed as he raised his weapon. "You've caused enough trouble," he said, his voice cold. McCabe's team froze, weapons at the ready. McCabe didn't flinch. He had been in situations like this before. The officer's grip on his weapon tightened. "Drop your weapons and surrender. Now." McCabe's gaze never left the officer's face. "You're not in control here," McCabe said calmly. "We're leaving." The officer laughed darkly. "I don't think so. You're trapped." McCabe assessed the situation quickly. He had no time for a standoff. With a quick motion, he signaled his team to spread out. "Cover me," he muttered. He turned to the soldier nearest him. "On my mark." The soldier nodded. McCabe turned back to the officer, his face expressionless. "You should have let us leave." The officer's smug smile faded as McCabe pulled the trigger. The shot was precise. The officer went down, and in the same motion, McCabe signaled the team to move. "Go." The team sprinted toward the vehicles, firing back to cover their retreat. The sound of gunfire filled the air as they made their way to the extraction point. McCabe's mind was still sharp, and his instincts kept him focused. The mission was a success. The enemy was left in disarray, unable to respond. They had hit them hard and fast, just as planned. The convoy sped off into the night, leaving the burning base behind them. McCabe looked out over the horizon, his thoughts already on the next move. The war wasn't over yet, but they had made a significant impact, and McCabe knew that they would be ready for whatever came next. The convoy sped down the narrow dirt road, its headlights cutting through the darkness as McCabe sat in the front vehicle, his eyes scanning the road. Ahead, the mission had been a success, but the aftermath left a bitter taste in his mouth. They had struck the enemy hard, taken out their communications, and destroyed their weapons cache, but McCabe knew that the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The enemy was more resilient than they had initially thought. Despite their success, McCabe couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The quiet hum of the engines was all that filled the air as they made their way back to the base, but McCabe's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were focused on the next move, the next threat. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward. The base finally came into view, the familiar silhouettes of the buildings illuminated by the light from the helipad. The convoy slowed as it approached, and McCabe's mind snapped back to the present. As they arrived at the command center, McCabe could feel the tension in the air. The team had done well, but they were all aware that the enemy wasn't going to sit back and let them get away with this. Inside the command center, General Thompson was already waiting for them, his face a mask of concern. "McCabe," the general said as McCabe walked in, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "We need to talk." McCabe nodded, his eyes narrowing. He could tell that this conversation was going to be serious. "What's going on, General?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. The general motioned for him to take a seat. "We've got word that the enemy has mobilized a counterattack," he said. "They're planning something big, and it's coming fast." McCabe's pulse quickened, but his face remained neutral. "How soon?" he asked. "We don't have much time," the general replied. "The reports say that they've gathered forces from other locations. They're planning a coordinated strike, and they've got more firepower than we anticipated." McCabe processed the information quickly. "We can't let them get the upper hand. We need to disrupt their plans before they can make a move." The general nodded. "That's exactly what I was thinking. We need to act fast, hit them where it hurts, and take out their leadership." McCabe's mind immediately started calculating their next move. They had to hit the enemy hard, but they also had to be smart about it. A full-scale attack wasn't feasible at this point. They needed to strike with precision, focusing on key targets that would cripple the enemy's ability to respond. "We can't waste time," McCabe said, his voice steady and resolute. "We'll move in under the cover of darkness, target their supply lines and command structures. We'll leave their forces disoriented and unable to respond." The general raised an eyebrow. "You think we can pull that off?" McCabe didn't hesitate. "We've done it before, sir. We just need to move quickly and hit them hard." The general studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, McCabe. You have your orders. Get your team ready. We'll move in tomorrow night." McCabe stood up, his mind already racing with plans. "I'll brief the team." As McCabe made his way out of the command center, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. They were about to head into the heart of enemy territory once again. But this time, they had the element of surprise on their side. As he walked toward the barracks, McCabe glanced around at his team. They were ready, no doubt about it. But this mission felt different. The enemy wasn't just any insurgent group. They were organized, strategic, and ruthless. The stakes had been raised, and McCabe knew they would have to be at their absolute best if they were going to pull this off. When McCabe entered the briefing room, the team was already assembled, waiting for him. He wasted no time getting down to business. "We've got a new mission," McCabe said, his voice commanding. "The enemy is planning a counterattack, and they've got reinforcements. Our objective is simple. We strike fast, hit their supply lines, and take out their leadership." The team listened intently, their expressions serious. McCabe could see the readiness in their eyes. They knew what was at stake. "We move out tomorrow night," McCabe continued. "We'll breach their perimeter and disable their command structure. We'll leave them in chaos, unable to respond." The team nodded, the weight of the mission sinking in. McCabe could see that they were all thinking the same thing. This was going to be their toughest operation yet. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation and strategy. McCabe's team worked tirelessly, checking their gear, reviewing maps, and running drills. By the time night fell, they were as ready as they would ever be. McCabe walked among them, offering brief words of encouragement, but he could sense their anxiety. This mission was different, and they all knew it. When the time came, McCabe gave the signal. The team loaded into the vehicles and began their journey to the enemy's position. The darkness outside seemed to press in on them as they neared the target. McCabe's thoughts were focused, his mind running through every possible scenario. They had no time to waste. The success of this mission depended on speed, precision, and the element of surprise. The convoy arrived at their destination, the lights of the enemy base just visible in the distance. McCabe's heart raced, but his focus remained sharp. This was it. They were about to face the enemy head-on, and there would be no turning back. "Stay sharp," McCabe muttered to the team as they prepared to disembark. This time, it was all or nothing. The base was quiet as McCabe and his team moved closer, the silence heavy and oppressive. They had successfully infiltrated the enemy's perimeter, and now they were just moments away from launching their attack. McCabe glanced at his team, their faces hardened with determination. This mission had been carefully planned, and they had done everything they could to prepare. But nothing in war was guaranteed. The next few minutes would decide everything. McCabe took a deep breath, his instincts kicking into overdrive as they crept closer to the enemy's main compound. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. He could hear the faint rustle of his team behind him, each soldier fully aware of the stakes. They had no room for error. As they neared the main entrance, McCabe held up his hand, signaling for the team to halt. He dropped to one knee, carefully surveying the area ahead. The compound was just beyond a cluster of trees, a few dim lights flickering around the perimeter. It was a stronghold, no doubt about it. But McCabe had led teams into places just as dangerous, and he wasn't about to falter now. "You know the drill," McCabe whispered to the team, his voice low and steady. "We breach, disable their communications, and move fast. We can't afford to be caught." His team nodded in response, their eyes locked onto him, ready to execute the plan. McCabe reached for the detonator in his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. A simple device, but one that would give them the edge. He had one shot at this. They all did. "Ready on 3, McCabe said quietly. His heart pounded in his chest as he counted down. 1, 2, 3. The sound of the explosion echoed through the night, the blast powerful and deafening. The gates to the compound were blown open, and McCabe was on his feet, leading the charge. The team followed close behind, moving swiftly and with purpose. The element of surprise was theirs, and they weren't about to waste it. As they stormed into the compound, the sounds of gunfire and shouts filled the air. The enemy was caught off guard, scrambling to respond. McCabe's mind was focused, his eyes scanning for the targets. They needed to move quickly, hit their objectives, and get out before the enemy could organize a defense. The team split up, each soldier taking on their assigned tasks. McCabe led his group toward the communications center, their weapons raised as they cleared rooms one by one. The enemy had no time to react. They were disoriented, their leadership compromised. McCabe knew this was their moment. He kicked open the door to the communications center and saw the enemy soldiers frantically trying to make a call. They froze when they saw McCabe and his team. There was no hesitation. McCabe gave the signal, and his team swiftly neutralized the threat. "It's done," McCabe said, his voice steady but urgent. "Let's move." They planted explosives on the communications equipment, ensuring that it would be rendered useless, and then quickly moved to their next objective. McCabe's thoughts raced. The plan was working, but the real danger still lay ahead. The enemy would regroup soon, and they needed to hit the supply depot before they had a chance to do so. As they made their way to the supply depot, the base came alive with activity. The enemy was starting to respond, but it was too late. McCabe's team had already taken the initiative. They reached the supply depot and immediately began setting charges on the stockpiles. They had to make sure nothing remained intact. As McCabe placed the last explosive, he heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters in the distance. The enemy was calling for reinforcements. "We've got to go," McCabe said, his voice calm but urgent. "Set the detonator. Now." One of the soldiers nodded, activating the trigger that would set off the explosives. McCabe's heart raced as the countdown began. They had seconds, maybe a minute, before the enemy would realize they were under attack. "Everyone out now," McCabe shouted. The team sprinted toward the extraction point, moving fast and staying low. The sound of helicopters grew louder, but McCabe knew they couldn't afford to be caught. As they reached the extraction point, McCabe glanced back at the base. The explosions had already begun, and the supply depot was going up in flames. The enemy was in chaos, and McCabe knew that they had done significant damage. But their job wasn't done yet. The enemy would send reinforcements, and McCabe had to make sure his team got out before they were surrounded. The vehicles were waiting, and the team piled in as fast as they could. As they sped away from the base, McCabe felt a sense of accomplishment, but there was no time to celebrate. This mission was only the beginning. The war was still ongoing, and McCabe knew that the enemy would retaliate. But for now, they had dealt a significant blow, and that was enough. As the convoy made its way back to base, McCabe looked out over the horizon, his thoughts focused on the road ahead. He had led his team through another successful operation, but there would be more challenges ahead. The fight wasn't over, and McCabe was ready. He always would be. The base was a hive of activity when McCabe and his team arrived back from the mission. Despite their success, there was no sense of celebration. The tension was palpable, the weight of the next phase already pressing down on them. As they disembarked from the vehicles, McCabe took a moment to look around. The team had completed their objectives. They had struck hard, taken out key infrastructure, and left the enemy in disarray. But McCabe knew better than to believe the fight was over. It had only just begun. Inside the command center, General Thompson was waiting for them. The mood in the room was heavy, the usual buzz of conversation replaced by a quiet intensity. McCabe could see the concern etched on the general's face as he looked up from a series of intelligence reports. "McCabe," the general said, his voice firm. "Come here." McCabe walked over, and the team followed. Standing in a line behind him, the general handed McCabe a set of new intel. "This just came in. The enemy has regrouped faster than we thought. They're already moving to retaliate. They've consolidated forces at a secondary position, and they're reinforcing with fresh supplies and personnel." McCabe's heart sank. He had known the enemy wouldn't stay down for long, but the speed of their recovery surprised him. "How soon before they're operational?" McCabe asked, scanning the report. The general's gaze hardened. "They're already setting up defenses. We're running out of time." McCabe turned to his team, his mind already working on the next move. They had just hit the enemy's supply lines, but now they were being faced with an even bigger problem. "We're going to hit them again," McCabe said, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "We can't let them rebuild. We'll hit their secondary position before they can set up a proper defense." The team nodded, ready for the next challenge. McCabe looked at each member of his team. "We're not going to let them think they have the upper hand. We strike fast, we hit their weakest points, and we leave before they can respond. Get ready." The general stepped forward, his expression grave. "This time, it won't be as easy as the last mission. They know we're coming now, and they'll be expecting us." McCabe didn't flinch. He had faced tougher odds before, and he wasn't about to back down now. "We move in quietly," McCabe said. "We hit them with everything we've got, and then vanish before they can react. We won't give them a chance to regroup." The general studied McCabe for a moment, then nodded. "All right, McCabe. I trust you. Make sure you have everything you need." McCabe turned to his team. "You heard the general. Get ready. We leave in 1 hour." The team dispersed quickly, preparing their gear, double-checking ammunition, and readying themselves for what was to come. McCabe couldn't afford to show any signs of hesitation. His mind was already planning the next steps, mapping out the most efficient route, and identifying key targets. He knew the stakes. If they didn't take the enemy out now, the war would drag on longer than necessary. The mission would require precision, timing, and the full cooperation of every man in the unit. It wasn't just about taking down the enemy. It was about maintaining control of the situation. As McCabe reviewed the mission details, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The enemy had moved too quickly, too efficiently. He had seen this kind of sudden response before, an organized, calculated move that came from someone with experience, someone who knew what they were doing. It bothered him. He had no proof, no concrete evidence that there was more to this enemy than met the eye, but McCabe trusted his instincts. Something didn't add up. As the team gathered in the briefing room, McCabe's mind was on the task at hand. He knew they were heading into enemy territory once again, and the odds were stacked against them. But McCabe was a man of action. He had never shied away from a challenge, and this mission was no different. "All right, team," McCabe said as they assembled. "We've got one shot at this. We hit hard, fast, and we leave before they can react. No hesitation, no mistakes. If we do this right, they won't have the time to mount a proper defense. We need to be in and out before the sun rises." "Understood." The team nodded, their faces serious. "Let's move," McCabe said. They loaded up into the vehicles and set off into the night, the convoy moving swiftly through the darkened roads. The air was thick with anticipation, and McCabe could feel the weight of the mission pressing on his shoulders. This time, there was no margin for error. As they neared the enemy's secondary position, McCabe's thoughts sharpened. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. Every decision, every move, had to be calculated. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. They had been successful before, but the enemy was no longer caught off guard. They would be ready. And McCabe knew that if they didn't execute perfectly, they could lose everything. The convoy slowed as they approached their target, and McCabe gave the signal for them to disembark. It was time to strike again. The mission was about to unfold, and McCabe was ready. The war was far from over, but tonight, they would make a stand. Tonight, they would prove that they weren't backing down. This time, they would hit the enemy harder than before. With that, McCabe and his team moved out into the night, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The mission had unfolded exactly as planned, the team hitting their objectives with military precision. The secondary position they had targeted was now a smoldering ruin. The enemy leadership shattered, and their communication systems completely disabled. The team had moved in, carried out their work, and extracted without the enemy even realizing the full extent of the damage until it was too late. As McCabe and his team made their way back to base in the early hours of the morning, the gravity of the mission's success settled over them. Their nerves were still on edge, but the job was done. The convoy had been relatively quiet on the way back, save for the occasional murmur of radio chatter and the sound of the tires grinding over the dirt roads. McCabe sat in the front vehicle, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. There was no relief yet. The war was still ongoing, and they couldn't afford to relax. The convoy eventually pulled into the base, and as they unloaded from the vehicles, McCabe took a moment to look around. The quiet hum of the base was punctuated by the faint sound of soldiers moving in the distance, their voices low as they began their own routines. But for McCabe, it felt different. They had achieved their objectives, but in this line of work, there was no such thing as closure. The mission was over, but the battle continued. Inside the command center, General Thompson was already waiting, his stern expression betraying no sense of relief. He had been briefed on the success of the operation, but McCabe knew better than to expect any accolades. The general was a man of few words, and when he spoke, it was always about the next challenge. McCabe, the general greeted him with a nod, motioning for him to take a seat. Good work out there. You and your team performed as expected. McCabe didn't respond immediately. He sat down, his eyes on the map spread out before him. It was littered with red markers, highlighting enemy positions, supply lines, and strongholds. McCabe had seen these maps countless times before, but today, they felt heavier. What's next, sir? McCabe asked, his voice low but filled with anticipation. The general leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the edge of the table. The enemy isn't done. Yet. They've been dealt a significant blow, but they'll regroup. We've made an impact, but it's not over. We're preparing for the next phase. McCabe's mind immediately shifted into overdrive. We can hit them again, he said. Keep the pressure on. If they're going to retaliate, we hit them hard, disrupt their command again, and keep them off balance. The general shook his head slightly. That's part of the plan. But we need to gather more intelligence first. The enemy is adapting. We've seen their tactics shift already. We need to know what we're up against before we make another move. McCabe considered this for a moment. Intelligence. The enemy was evolving, and McCabe knew it. They had to stay one step ahead. How long before we get that intel? He asked. It'll take time, the general replied. We've got teams out there, but we can't rush it. We need to know where their next move is coming from, what resources they have left, and how they plan to retaliate. McCabe nodded. Understood. We'll be ready. The general glanced at the team behind McCabe. You and your men have done well, he said, his voice firm but with a hint of respect. But this war is far from over. You've taken down a lot, but the enemy is resilient. We need to be prepared for anything. McCabe stood up, meeting the general's gaze. We're ready for whatever comes next, he said, his voice steady. We'll keep the pressure on. The general didn't smile, but McCabe could see a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. Good, the general replied. That's what I want to hear. As McCabe and his team left the command center, the weight of the mission still hung heavily in the air. They had struck hard, but the enemy was regrouping. The general had made it clear they couldn't stop now. McCabe's team moved quickly to their quarters to rest, but McCabe stayed behind for a few moments, his mind already on the next phase of the operation. The enemy wouldn't be down for long. They had taken a significant hit, but McCabe knew they would regroup. He had been in enough battles to understand how quickly things could turn. The key was to stay ahead of them. He needed to keep his team sharp, ready for whatever came next. And McCabe wasn't about to let his guard down. As the sun began to rise over the base, McCabe looked out over the horizon, his thoughts focused on the future. The war wasn't over, but with every successful mission, they were one step closer to victory. He wasn't about to stop until it was won. This emotional story takes you through the highs and lows of an elite team of soldiers as they battle against a resilient enemy. With each mission, they grow stronger, but the stakes are always higher. The story focuses on the true essence of teamwork, sacrifice, and the emotional weight of combat. As the team infiltrates enemy territory and executes precision strikes, they face unexpected challenges that test their strength, resolve, and emotional limits. Through their journey, the bonds between them grow, making this emotional story a testament to courage and survival. The intensity of battle is matched by the personal struggles they endure, making the emotional story all the more gripping. With the success of each operation, however, comes the harsh reality that the war is far from over, and the next challenge could be their biggest yet. As the soldiers navigate through the fog of war, they must deal with their own inner battles, showcasing the emotional depth of each character. This emotional story not only highlights the resilience of soldiers in combat, but also delves deep into the psychological toll that war takes. The journey of these soldiers is a raw and powerful emotional story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, offering a glimpse into the complexities of war and the unspoken strength required to face it.